want to welcome everyone who is tuning in. What normally appears at this hour is the intelligence assessment with Kevin Shipp. Kevin was unable to make it tonight, but we've got a very exciting new guest joining us here on Crowdsource the Truth. Join me, please, everyone, in welcoming investigative journalist Michael Volpe. Michael, how are you?
Good.
It's very good to see you. How are you tonight?
Doing very well.
Okay, so you brought to my attention a really troubling situation, something that you've been researching for some time, having to do with Child Protective Services, and this is specifically SWAT teams that have been formed in the state of Arizona to actually go into family homes where sometimes unfounded allegations of child abuse are happening. They actually take the children from their parents, which is undoubtedly traumatic to the child. And why don't you fill us in exactly what is going on?
Right. So this was based on a case that's received international attention, but it's one out of many. So that particular case was out of Chandler, Arizona, and it happened late February. And parents took their, I think, 2-year-old boy, was like toddler age, to a doctor. Doctor said the child's got a high fever, so you got to take him to the emergency room. So they get in the car, and by the time they're in their car, they've driven some time, they feel like the fever's come down. So they go home. The doctor calls the emergency room and finds out they never took the kid. And the doctor called department in Arizona, it's called Department of Child Safety, though the generic term and where it's often called is Child Protective Services. But so they called DCS because that's what it's called in Arizona. DCS got a warrant, and the cops showed up with a warrant, broke down the door, and I believe they have 3 kids, this family. They took all 3. And the reason essentially given is, I told you to take them to the emergency room and you didn't. And that's the 2 key words when that in like the sphere of CPS is neglect and abuse. And so the doctor felt it was a form of neglect and abuse. And one other thing, there's always a judge who signs off on something. So a judge actually signed off on this kind of warrant, giving the police this much power. So they showed up, and keep in mind, the argument was over 1 child, and they took all of their kids.
Wow.
With the SWAT team. And fortunately, what happened is the media picked up on it, and it turned into a big, hullabaloo. And earlier this month, they got all of their kids back. Another judge, so it's not entirely clear which judge signed the warrant, but another judge decided that they're fit enough to get their kids back.
Right.
So one thing to keep in mind, if they showed up with the SWAT team and they got their kids back in 2 months, I think it's self-evident the SWAT team may have been overkill.
Well, of course, but I mean, 2 months. I presume this is the video, right? Chandler, Arizona?
Right, yes.
Let's listen for a moment. So it's 10:45 at night in Arizona, and these guys are knocking on the door. They send a SWAT team, not an officer.
Mm-hmm. Right,
probably asleep.
And one thing to keep in mind, the reason they broke the door down, nobody answered. And the reason nobody answered is the parents were in the room with the child because they were still concerned the child might be sick, which was like deep in the house.
Right.
So they
don't expect anybody. I'm sure they don't expect anybody knocking on their door at 11:30 at night when they have little kids.
The thing to keep in mind, the police, how dare you not answer the door when we knock? So we may as well just break it down.
Yeah.
Right.
So how did you become involved in this story?
Well, I know stories like it. The story I did, I could have done anytime. So this is an example of what's referred to as medical kidnapping. Right. So I knew the background in the general sense. So medical kidnapping is if a doctor tells you to do one thing and you dare to say, well, I might do something else, the doctor considers that abuse and neglect. And I was on with someone else. This does not mean that you should not get a second opinion. It does not mean that your doctor is going to call DCS or CPS because you disagree with them. Right. However, it's certainly a growing trend that doctors do this. So it was an example of that. The other thing is, in general, these sorts of takings, if you will, happen because federally funds filter to the states and they incentivize this sort of taking. So DCS or CPS or whatever you call it in that particular state, they get money every time they put a child in foster care. They get money to keep the child in foster care. They also get money if they reunite the child with the parents. However, they get a lot less money if they reunite the child than if they keep the child in foster care. So the incentive is to keep the child in foster care. Furthermore, they get even more money if that same child who's in foster care then gets adopted out. And this started in 1974. There was a law. It's the acronym is CAPTA. I think it's Child Abuse Protection Treatment Act. I think it's what it's called. But
so it's Gerald Ford.
It was Walter Mondale was the brainchild, but Ford would have. I don't know if it was Ford or Nixon who signed it, but the brainchild was Mondale, who was I think in the Senate. But that was the originally where you pay the states to keep kids in foster care. But the main ones happened during the Clinton administration. Section Title 4E of Social Security. So Section B is if they're put into foster care and then you reunite them later. Section E is if you keep them in foster care. And the important thing is you get a lot more money to keep them in foster care than to reunite them. Secondly, there's a separate law called ASFA, the Adoption and Safe Families Act. And this law gives you even more money if you then adopt them out. And it's not an either or. So if you say keep them in foster care for a year to a year and a half, you get that money. Then you adopt them out and you get even more money. And in my article, I quoted a woman named Nancy Schaefer, who's very important. She called this double dipping. So there's multiple incentives to get money to keep kids and to move kids. And this is a form of human trafficking. And I could have written this article anytime. I saw an opportunity to attach myself to this Chandler raid to explain the larger issues with what's going on. And one other thing, I looked up some statistics. In the 1960s, there were less than 5,000 children in foster care nationally. There's approximately 14,000 just in Arizona.
Wow.
Approximately 450,000 nationally. And so you can't say that it lines up exactly with the federal funding. But a few years before the federal funding, very few people in foster care, you get this incentive and it's 100 times roughly increase. And you could say maybe CPS around the country is better at finding bad parents, or maybe they're looking to get kids and put them into foster care. And another thing people need to keep in mind, healthy kids, and healthy that means physically and mentally, are easier to adopt out. So in fact, the incentive is to take kids, not broken kids, not the sexually abused kids, not the physically abused kids, because who wants to deal with that? The kids who have very few or no problems at all, because those are the ones everyone wants to adopt. So in fact, because you get even more money if you move them into foster care and adopt them out.
Right.
And so you will see kids who should have no business in foster care. It's almost always because they've got an eye on getting those kids adopted out.
Well, and I think we've heard a lot of nightmare stories about children in foster care getting abused. And I mean, obviously you're talking about a family where, you know, they just said, oh, well, maybe we don't need to go to the emergency room. Let's keep an eye on this kid. We don't know their side of the story. Maybe they got some weird vibe from this doctor. Maybe he was a new doctor. And now we've got a case where 3 children taken from, how old were these children?
The toddler, I don't remember how old the other two, and
Toddler.
I think it's 3. I think, right, but I think it was around 2 years old. My
2
understanding
months, if
was,
you're 2 years old, is like forever. Think of the permanent mental trauma on a child interacting with the police like this, taken to some holding place, given to somebody who's not their parents. That is devastating.
Right. My understanding was the kid had a high fever, something 104, 105. But by the time they got the kid home, it was like 100, 101. So their side of the story is my child had a fever and the fever came down. And if you have kids, that happens. That's their side of the story. The other part of the story that's interesting is these parents did not vaccinate.
Right.
And the doctor felt that this feverish child, unvaccinated, would be a danger. At least that's what's reported. What's important about that is CPS all around the country will swear up and down, we do not take kids because they're unvaccinated. That is your choice. We do not take them. So that's important because obviously if they say that, that's just a conspiracy theory. So we should not consider them taking them just because they're unvaccinated. They must have another reason. So the fact that that's what's reported. You know what? Let me add one other thing. This is all reported. The problem is these parents have been gagged. There's very little they can say, so it's all reported. You don't see interviews with them because they're not really allowed to do interviews. So their side of the story, they don't really get a chance to tell the media their side of the story because judges have said you're not really allowed. Right. Despite the fact that I heard there was this thing called the First Amendment, but not necessarily in child protection cases.
So here we're at the point in the video, in the body cam footage, where the police have busted in the door. They're screaming in the door. This looks like a pretty rural area. We hear the alarm going off.
We're here to check on the safety.
They treated that. This is the kind of force you bring to El Chapo.
Right. Or Roger Stone.
The parents were deep inside the house, so when they knocked, they didn't hear them. And it's sort of like authorities. Doctors, how dare you not listen to me? Police, how dare you not answer the door when I knock? And they all take this overkill and aggressive action. The doctor calls Child Protective Services as soon as you're not listening to them, and the cops break your door down as soon as you don't answer the door when they knock nicely.
So what was the relationship between the parents and this doctor? They must not have known each other too well.
Again, not entirely clear, because these parents aren't allowed to tell their side of the story.
So you haven't been able to interview them, nothing?
I've not been able to interview them. I've been able to interview people who talk to them. But even those people are very careful about what they say, because if they tell me the wrong thing and I print it, the parents get in trouble because there's only certain information that's allowed out.
That's crazy. So the danger to the parents is that if they speak about this, then what? The family court says you lose your kids? Great question.
There's almost no one in this country with more power than judges. Then they're violating a court order. You want to know how powerful a judge is? Internalize what court order means. They are then what's called in contempt of court, and then they are at the mercy of the judge. They have violated the judge's rule, and the judge can, within reason, and reason is in the eye of the beholder, punish them. Everything from a fine, from taking their kids to putting them in jail.
Well, they could put them in jail, and then the kids by default have to go back with child protective services if the parents are in jail.
Right. So some punishment you and I haven't thought of.
Wow.
So I'll give you, there was actually an article yesterday and today in the Arizona Republic where they described how the judge kicked out a state representative. Her name is Karen Townsend. Because he decided that she had violated his gag order. And she said, I didn't, number one. Number two, if you're going to kick out a state representative, what are you going to do to a regular person? So she is not directly involved in the case, but she wanted to be there as an observer, and he kicked her out. Told her, you can't be in this courtroom with me.
Wow. So you've written this article for Daily Caller, and you're telling us that Arizona's Department of Child Safety has a pattern of sending SWAT teams.
Right. So they number one, the agency has been rotten for a very long time. It used to be called Child Protective Services. And then it got so rotten, it was a part of another agency. They made it like its own agency in the cabinet. So the equivalent of like Trump's cabinet, but on the state level. But nothing really got fixed, and they placed so many kids into foster care that there was one article from 2016 where they have kids sleeping in their offices because they've got so many of them that they can't put them into foster care. But yeah, and they're using these SWAT team raids. They're using medical kidnapping. I interviewed multiple people from an oversight group, and one of the guys said, of the however many kids they have, I'd estimate 90% have no business being in foster care at all.
90%.
90, correct. And look, in my opinion, even parents that are so bad they have no business parenting their child 90% of the time, you're still better off with them than in foster care. Foster care is just brutal. And I should mention one other interesting fact. When they I think there were 3 kids in this raid from Arizona, from Chandler. They placed them in multiple homes.
So they're separated from their siblings.
Right, yeah.
What trauma on the kids?
Right. Can I give you a great anecdote?
Sure.
There is he's dead now because he got the death penalty. There's a guy, they called him the tourniquet killer. His name was, I think, Anthony Allen Shore.
Sounds great already.
Right. I watched him. I watched his daughter. Her name, I think, was Tiffany Shore. It's a show called Evil Lives Here. So while he was a serial killer, he was molesting each of his 2 daughters. Their school called their version of CPS, wherever they were living at the time, because they looked malnourished. He convinced those 2 girls that foster care was worse than living with him, even though he was molesting both of them. And one way he convinced them is they'll split you up and now you're in the system and it's over. And they believed him.
What was that guy's name?
Tourniquet killer is, I think it's Anthony Allen Shore. But if you put in tourniquet killer into a search engine, it should come up. So CPS shows up, a caseworker, and he cleans up the house. He convinces the girls to act nice. And so she thinks it's a perfect home. So a serial killer fooled them. So
how effective is this agency? Right.
Exactly. So think on the one hand, they're taking kids from a family that decided not to go to a doctor because they thought that their kid's fever had come down. On the other hand, the serial killer somehow looks like a perfect parent.
Right. Wow. This is really something. I don't know if a lot of people know about this. So other than Daily Caller, where is this being covered? Is it getting a lot of coverage on mainstream media?
The issue of foster care itself, very little. In Arizona, this case is getting an enormous amount of coverage. And I would say I studied the media, is probably an overstatement, but there was a fair amount of coverage on it. There's a website called Medical Kidnap.
Yeah.
Which it doesn't just track. The broader term is called legal kidnapping. So that's when CPS just takes your kid for whatever reason, a poor reason, no reason at all. So they call it legal, and they call it legal kidnapping because if CPS takes it, it's kind of legal, regardless of what the reason is. But no, it doesn't get a lot of coverage. And one of the reasons why it doesn't get a lot of coverage is 99 people out of 100, if you stopped them on the street and you said so-and-so has their kids in foster care, what's the thought? Well, they probably terrible parents because the only people who have kids in foster care are terrible parents. So it doesn't get a lot of coverage because the presumption is if your child's in foster care, they must be there for a good reason. And certainly the federal funding doesn't get a lot of coverage. So people really don't understand that CPS has a financial incentive to do this. So you see stories here and there. And certainly, for instance, I live in Chicago. I think they call it Department of Child and Family Services here, so DCFS. It's received some coverage. There's been some high-profile deaths. So we have the Sun-Times and the Tribune.
Deaths of children?
Yeah, in foster care. There's a recent case of a kid who was in foster care, and then they placed him back with the parents who then killed him.
Whoa.
But so it gets some coverage here. I see stories. A lot of it is local. As far as putting a national view on it, you see it on occasion, but no, I don't think that the average person understands just how jacked up foster care is and child protective services. And they certainly don't understand how incentivized it is to take money, to take kids because you get money. And can I mention one other thing?
Please.
In the article, I referred to a woman named Nancy Schaefer. She's very important. In fact, I'm talking about Social Security Title 4B, Title 4E, CAPTA, ASPA. We all copy her. We're all plagiarizing. She wrote in 2008 a white paper, what you'd call a white paper, called The Corrupt Business of CPS. And so she was a Georgia state senator, and a constituent had contacted her and explained the constituent story involving Georgia's version of CPS. And before she knew it, it was something like 300 people. So that was in 2008. She wound up losing her next election, and she decided she wanted to be an activist. There it is, The Corrupt Business of CPS. And so she became an activist. In 2010, she was murdered.
Wait, Schaefer was murdered?
Yes. According to the official statement, or the official by the police investigation, her husband of 52 years murdered her and then shot himself because there was a downturn in the market and he became distraught. Her husband was a stockbroker, retired.
Whoa.
So presumably had seen some ups and downs in the market. So the idea that her 50-some-year husband would murder her and himself is
Doesn't
ludicrous,
sound right.
and yet that is the official statement. And so there's a lot of conspiracy. I don't know who killed her. I don't believe for 1 second it was her husband. It's entirely possible that the things she was working on, and the only things she was working on at that point were CPS related, got her killed, and that's how serious this business is.
Wow. So, Mike, a lot of times the things that we cover here are the types of things that people like Anderson Cooper would call conspiracy theories. So when we hear in the mainstream news that a former Georgia state senator was murdered by her husband who then killed himself, there are some people who hear that and say, okay, that's got to be true. And there are other people who hear that and say, that sounds not quite right to me. And then people call us conspiracy theorists for even doubting the mainstream news. Now, a lot of people who watch Crowdsource the Truth might have a tendency towards thinking that Child Protective Services is bad somehow, or that the government is bad. And I don't think it's necessarily that. I think what it is that if there is an individual out there who wants to harm children, they're not going to go get a job at the old age home. They're going to go somewhere where there are children that they can interact with and do whatever it is that they're going to do with. So Child Protective Services and things like it are inherently attractive to someone who wants to access children. And all you need is one sophisticated psychopath, some highly intelligent person, because obviously, we see some sketchy scumbag walking down the street who looks like a serial killer. That guy's going to go to jail right away. But when we hear stories about, there was this guy, BTK, the blind torture.
Did Ted Bundy look like a serial killer?
Right. These guys who have a lot of charisma and can convince people and talk and sound like a normal person, they're really dangerous. So the question becomes, how many of these Child Protective Service organizations from state to state around the country have been infiltrated by someone like this, who an individual gets in there and understands how the system works, knows, oh, we can send a kid over here, and maybe they know that person or have some way of manipulating these things. How can we solve this?
Right. It's a great question. Look, the idea that power would go to someone's head, number one, that's a conspiracy theory. So are you familiar with the journalist Cheryl Atkinson?
Absolutely, I know her personally.
Right, she said something on Twitter that was great. She goes, a conspiracy is two or more people planning a crime. She's like, that's not a theory. That's what a conspiracy is.
Yeah.
So she's like, are you saying that there's no such thing as two or more people planning a crime? So that's not a theory. I don't deal in conspiracy theories. I deal in conspiracies.
Yes.
I don't know who killed Nancy Schaefer. I don't know that it had anything to do with anything. I know that there's no way that a stockbroker of 50 years is going to be so distraught by a downturn in the market that they're going to decide to kill himself and his wife.
And did you speak to any of her friends or associates? Did people say, well, yeah, the husband was a nut job and hated her, or people were shocked?
No, there was no friends. One of his friends said, I saw him earlier today. He was fine. Look, and they had some money troubles. It looked like they were about to have their house foreclosed on, but the money trouble, they weren't going to be homeless, even if their house got foreclosed on. Okay, they might have to move into an apartment.
When you've been married to somebody for 50 years.
It's not ideal. I think she may have had all the way to great grandkids, certainly to grandkids. Are you saying that with your large extended family, you weren't going to be able to resolve your money problems? That this guy,
or at least have a place to stay. Yeah.
And if he's so distraught, why did he kill his wife? So,
right. Why not just kill himself?
Right. And so I don't know what happened. So I don't
well,
deal
take
in
a look at this,
conspiracy.
Mike, because when we put in Nancy Schaefer, Georgia murder, we're not getting that. We're getting your article. We're getting articles she wrote about Child Protective Services.
You'll find articles that will spin theories about what happened. I won't do that because I don't know what happened. What I firmly believe is there's no way that her husband killed her, and I believe there's a very good chance she was killed as a result of the things she was working on related to Child Protective Services. She got as close to as anybody did to really unraveling all of the things that were going on. If you want to understand this stuff, you understand what she understood and you understand her murder. That right. I firmly believe.
I never heard about this before. This is really interesting.
Look, you go through the corrupt business of CPS and everything I'm saying as far as the money is in there. ASPA is in there. The Social Security Title 4B, Title 4E is in there. CAPTA is in there. We all copying her. Everybody learned this because she figured it out first.
Wow.
And it was a very big deal. For the reports were she was working on a documentary. She was doing a lot of speeches, and she was absolutely a threat. As far as what you say about Child Protective Services workers, probably there's all sorts of folks that are child molester types, but more than that, is it really hard to believe that as a caseworker with the ability to take children from their parents, there aren't going to be a few that let that power go to their head? You need to be a conspiracy theorist to consider the possibility that Child Protective Services caseworkers who have a good life would go, you know what? I get off on seeing kids get separated from their parents. You know,
I want to be careful because I think probably the overwhelming majority of people who get involved in something like that are doing it because they want to help kids. But remember, all we need is one person in there who understands how it works, who can do this. And again, a network of people, one person in each office or one person who's the head of the whole thing. And also, I'm sure there's, look, when there's a financial incentive, who knows what's going on in the office and who knows how far removed the people pushing the buttons to make the decision are from the actual situation. You know, I mean, they say, oh, you know, this kid could die, it's an emergency, the parents aren't taking it to the emergency room. Somebody might think they're doing the right thing, but there's communication breakdowns, all kinds of stuff that goes on. Now, here's another interesting thing, Mike. When I go to DuckDuckGo, which viewers of Crowdsource the Truth are always telling me I should be using instead of Google, and I put in Nancy Schaefer murder, I don't even need Georgia or any of that. We've got Nancy Schaefer was murdered after exposing CPS corruption. Senator did her fight against CPS. You know, so this is all relevant search terms coming back. This is disgraceful that YouTube decides. I would personally like to be able to decide what here is, reliable and what is not. For instance, the first article that came up when I found it on Google was talking about guns of a certain caliper. And I think what the author meant was caliber. So when I see a mistake about something important yet simple like that right out of the gate, my assumption is that the author is maybe not too dialed into attention to detail, and perhaps there are other errors. But this is something for us to really dig into, because if
you want to understand CPS nationally, you find everything you can about the work she did. She did speeches. She did read the corrupt business. Start with the corrupt business of CPS. You read all of her other work and you try to understand her murder. Look, it's not a conspiracy that she was murdered.
Right.
The official record says she was murdered. They just say she was murdered by her husband. Well, one other interesting thing, and there's a sort of, it's an irony, and I don't think it's a coincidental irony. She was also very pro-life.
Pro-life.
She was as far right as you get on the issue of pro anti-abortion. Mm-hmm. So it's ironic that someone pro-life would be murdered by someone who then killed themselves. So that's sort of like sticking the knife to her after she's dead to make her the victim of a murder by the person closest to her. So was someone trying to do that?
Send a message.
Right, like really stick it to her. But it's not a conspiracy that she was murdered. It's not a conspiracy that she did a lot of work on CPS. It's not a conspiracy that she made a lot of enemies doing a lot of work on CPS. None of those are conspiracies. It's not a conspiracy that her husband, I think his name is Bruce, as I see. It's not a conspiracy that he was a stockbroker. It's not a conspiracy theory that he was that the official story is he became distraught because the market had downturned and his investments had tanked. That's not a conspiracy theory. That's what the police are saying. And what I'm telling you, I used to be a stockbroker. The idea that you would spend your entire life in the market and become so distraught, no matter how badly it tanked, that you had to kill your wife. No, I don't believe that for 1 second. I don't believe that he would become that distraught. It's tough, but it's not the first downturn in the market that he dealt with. He should have had enough experience to be able to handle it. Markets go up, markets go down. And if you spend 50 years in the market, which he did, you would be able to handle it.
Now, let me point something else out to you, Michael. Here we've got GBI, the Georgia Bureau of Investigation. Have you ever heard about that before?
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
but
just from this case. The state version of the FBI.
You heard about it from this case?
I believe they investigated the case. What I can tell you is that area is full of corruption. I did a lot of work on...
Just wait, one quick second. The question I'm asking is, before you researched this case about Nancy Schaefer, were you aware that there was a Georgia Bureau of Investigation?
Yes, there's a State Bureau of Investigation, I believe, in every state.
And okay, I didn't know that. The only time I've ever heard about this before was the Colorado Bureau of Investigation investigated John Benet Ramsey's murder. Why don't they just use the FBI? What's the point of the GBI?
If they consider it a state crime. Or
then why don't the cops look at it? See, they've got this way of kind of like gerrymandering these investigations. I mean, I wonder, like, who decides why is this not the cops investigating the murder?
Right.
And if she's a former senator, why is the FBI not investigating? She was senator until when? 2008?
From 2004 to 2008.
So 2 years after she leaves the Senate, she's murdered. And they don't have the Capitol Police, they don't have the FBI, they have the GBI.
Look, the part that should raise all eyebrows is the murder was very high profile. And then they cover it a little here, a little there. They, her husband killed her. The media reports on it. There's a few people that say, I don't know, this doesn't make sense, and then it dies out.
Right.
And so it's like the media really had no interest in figuring out, is this correct? Why would her husband do this? Are you guys telling us the right story? And it just died out.
Joe Napoli raises the valid point that they were able to use that excuse because it was 2008 and there was a huge market downturn. But this was 2010, so 2 years later, the guy's still upset?
That's, again, he was a stockbroker his entire adult life. It's not the first downturn. He dealt with a lot of downturns. You're telling me a guy, he invested his money, his other people's money for a living. I think he was retired by this point. You're telling me that a guy who spent his entire adult life in the market. And yeah, 2008 was a serious downturn. You're saying because there's a serious downturn, he flips out?
Yeah.
Why didn't he flip out the first time, the second time, the sixth time? Do you understand how many downturns he faced? Why this one? How come this one was so crazy that not only he killed himself, but he killed his wife? Why?
I'll tell you this, Mike, there's no way that anybody could tell that you're from Chicago.
Right.
Now, one of our regular viewers is in the chat. Dynamex. Dynamex is asking if you know anything about Camilla Wright's husband.
Camilla, I know the Rice case in Illinois.
Right,
Is that in Illinois?
W-R-I-G-H-T.
No, it's not a case I'm familiar with.
Okay, so what is your focus? Like, how did you get onto this CPS? You're a journalist, you write for
Right.
Daily Caller and others.
I do, in general, I do family court and court corruption. And so some people call me specifically with CPS cases. I did this article because I thought that if you attach, if you say, here's what happened in the Chandler case, and here's in the larger sense why this stuff happens, the Daily Caller would want it, which they did. But the first story I did was about Pennsylvania CPS, which is in October of 2013. But money flows in the billions through these courts. There's a lot of money being made to go after parents, whether you use CPS or not.
Right. Yeah, and I mean, look, like you said, financial incentive is going to drive things in a particular direction. So let's see, I just had that Camilla thing. Now, that's still on the corrupt business of child protection. So do you have a website, or is there a way that people can contact you with tips or information?
Right. Well, I have a blog, but for the most part, it's theprovocateur.blogspot.com with two E's in the DA, so THEE, provocateur.blogspot.com. But that generally is just links to my other articles. But my email address is on that website. If you guys want to contact me, you're gonna have to go find the web. I won't give it on the air.
Got it.
If you really want to contact me, do some research and find the website, and then you'll find my email address. I write for Daily Caller and some other ones. I just did a story about a woman named Minnie Gonzalez on El Dia, which is a newspaper for Hispanics. She's Hispanic, but she is taking on family court corruption in Connecticut, which is very significant as well. And all of these things are interconnected to each other.
Right. I'm still trying to find the provocateur.blogspot.com.
THEPROVOCATEUR.blogspot.com.
I'm pretty not great at spelling. So this is have you had any pushback? I mean, this is a pretty sensitive area. Someone was willing to kill a state senator over it.
I've had, not with CPS, number one, I'm currently being sued, I guess, although it looks like the lawsuit is going nowhere.
Being sued by who?
Not family court related. So I've been sued twice by the same person, but that was the former Surgeon General of the Navy, a guy named Donald Caldwell Arthur.
Who's representing him?
Sometimes myself. I had a lawyer for a while, and it was in Massachusetts.
Him. Who's representing the plaintiff?
It's a law firm called Beauregard, Burke and Frankel. This is all in Massachusetts. He had 3 bogus degrees, claimed to have a combat action ribbon, even though he's a doctor, and then he destroyed a man's life. So I had plenty of reason to write about him, but he decided to sue me, and then the lawsuit's 3+ years, and it's still going on, though I don't think they're really at this point pursuing it. The main case where I've had a lot of pushback is I did a lot of work on a woman named Sandra Grazzini-Rucki, who's been smeared by everyone. She was covered by 2020, and I've had cops threaten me there. I've been threatened with a lawsuit. I've had other employees or other court actors threatened to go to the cops, all sorts of things. But no, I haven't had my life threatened, if you're asking, and I don't know why.
Well, it's a good thing. I think I've found this thing about the husband that Dynamex was asking about, and this looks like Georgia Assistant Attorney The husband of the Georgia Assistant Attorney General was shot to death. I don't know if that's related, but it's all happening in Georgia. So, Mike, it seems like there's a lot of weird stuff going on in Arizona. Do you think that's true? We've had on this show.
As far as CPS is concerned, I found a lot of bad things CPS related in Arizona. And one of the problems that I found is, number one, judges in Arizona have even more power than judges have, and judges have all sorts of. In Arizona?
Yeah.
Well, they have their own lobbying arm in Arizona. It's called the Arizona Judicial Council. So the judges have lobbyists who lobby on their behalf, because apparently the judges don't have enough power on their own, so they need people lobbying to give them even more power. So, for instance, they're currently trying to get a bill passed that will effectively give them their own private police force.
For who?
They already
judges?
have like county sheriffs who are supposed to protect them, but that's not enough. We better have our own private police force. There was a judge who wrote a bill and gave that bill to a legislator, and the legislator put that bill into the legislature because, it's not enough for the judge to rule on the cases. She also wants to write bills and have those bills become law. Wow. So they run all sides in Arizona. The judges there have even more power than normal, and judges normally have all sorts of power. Yeah. So that's one of the problems, and DCS there has even less oversight than they have normally, and they have very little oversight normally.
CPS, you're saying, has very little oversight.
Correct. They have even less than they normally have. So that combination together, it makes CPS. They call it Department of Child Safety, so it's DCS there.
Got it.
Right. Now, the generic term is CPS, and in many places it's called that. But if in your state it's called Department of Child Welfare or Department of Child Family, it's the same thing. They're just using different terms.
Now, Thomas Tyson raises a good question. Do you know anything about the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, and how does that play into this nationwide CPS, DCS, et cetera?
Right. So it's a nonprofit that tries to find missing kids. The only direct contact I've had with them is on that Rucky case, where they tried to find the quote-unquote missing kids. However, the kids weren't missing. The kids were in hiding because the court was insisting they live with their abusive father.
The serial killer guy.
Right. And so in that particular case, I believe they involved themselves in a case they had no business being involved in. But their overall goal is to try to find missing kids.
So wait a minute. So when the serial killer is there, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children gets involved and says, "Now everything's okay." But
no, that's Child Protective Services that got involved, and they said everything's okay.
Oh, I see. So what did the center? They tried to look for the kids, but they weren't missing.
The kids weren't missing. They ran away. They were hiding. They involved themselves in a case where they should have known why the kids were missing, in quotation marks. In the Rucky case, what happened, besides me, you'll hear a completely different story, but despite what you may hear on 2020, an abusive man was given custody, and the kids were forced to live with this abusive man. And before they could live with him, they ran and were hidden.
Got it.
And the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children got involved to try to find these kids who were clearly hiding from their father, and they weren't missing. So they involved themselves, in my opinion, in a case they shouldn't have involved themselves in.
People are telling me that Janet Reno and her Arizona mafia are notoriously corrupt.
Right.
Yeah.
But it didn't. But look, after Janet Reno, it was a Republican governor, Jan Brewer. So see, they are correct, but it didn't. DCS did. It was CPS for a while, and then it turned into DCS. It didn't get that much better under Brewer. Brewer recognized that it was a huge problem, and what she did in 2014 is she dissolved CPS. It was called Child Protective Services then, and then it was like an organ of a larger agency. She dissolved it, and she created the Department of Child Safety, which is its own agency, which was supposed to be like a cabinet level post, and that was supposed to make it better, but it didn't make it better.
So what do you think people should do, Michael? Should they write to senators? Should they?
Sure. So you want my solution?
Yeah.
My solution is to eliminate, hold on,
Sure.
my phone won't stop.
No problem.
My solution is to eliminate CPS nationwide.
Uh-huh.
Hold on one second.
Sure, no problem. And
Okay.
so
My
eliminate.
solution is to eliminate CPS, or whatever they call it, nationwide. There is you've heard of Law and Order SVU?
Yes.
Right. Well, in every jurisdiction, there are special victims units. These kids are supposed to be protected by special victims units.
By the cops. Right.
Right. You don't need CPS. CPS, I guess, gets involved if you're a bad parent, but not so bad you need to go to jail. Well, my idea is if you're not bad enough to go to jail, then the government doesn't need to involve itself in your problems.
Yeah. No, I
And so
agree.
that's my solution. I think people should call and tell their senator, why do we justify its existence? Isn't it taking kids who shouldn't be taken? Is it protecting the kids that are supposed to be protected? And if it's not doing that, why does it exist at all?
Yeah.
Why are we paying these people salaries? Well,
Right.
we're putting these kids into foster care. Is that better? Why do we have all of these things?
Yeah. Well, and certainly the financial incentives are troubling because obviously anytime, people are paid to do something, they're going to want to do it. It's
Right.
simple.
I can't prove it, but I've heard stories that some of these guys get bonuses based on how many kids they place, that there are minimum requirements for how many kids you have to take.
Quotas and whatnot.
Right. Follow the money, as they said in
Right.
in All the President's Men. The money leads to taking kids. The money leads to keeping kids. The money leads to adopting the kids you've put into foster care out. So if that's where the money leads, you shouldn't be surprised if that's where those kids are going.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, no, it's not only troubling, but it should surprise no one that kids are being taken for no reason, because you're getting a financial incentive to take them. I can make one other point.
Yeah.
DCS, CPS, whatever you want to call it, it's a bureaucracy.
Right.
In the bureaucracy, the number one goal of any bureaucracy is to justify its existence. If you are a CPS caseworker and you have 10 potential cases and you go and see the 10 parents and you come back and you say, oh, you know what, they were great.
Nothing's
We
wrong.
don't need to get ourselves involved.
Yeah.
You're not going to have a job.
Right.
See, you're a project manager for Apple. The way you keep your job, you do the project well, it helps sales, and you get promoted.
Right.
The way you keep your job at CPS is you find kids and you take them. That's not necessarily doing your job right, because if those kids didn't need to be taken, you're not really doing it right.
Yeah.
However, if you investigate and say these kids don't need to be taken, you're not justifying your existence.
It's the same thing we hear about prosecutors wanting to just end cases quickly and stick somebody in jail because that's considered a successful prosecution. Rather than doling out justice, they're doling out criminal sentences. And so you point out accurately that we've got all the confusion of bureaucracy. We've got somebody in there who's, as you say, trying to justify their existence in the position. It seems like maybe eliminating, what you just suggested is a great idea. Why do we need this separate thing? We've got the police. Maybe there should be some child psychologists hired by the police or something, but, I don't think you should be able to take somebody's kids until they've been judge and jury convicted.
Right. My philosophy always is family matters should stay within the family, and you should limit out the decisions made outside of the family.
Yeah.
I'm also firmly of the belief there's no such thing as a functional family. They're all dysfunctional. I don't think you can function with 4 people and it's 2,000 square foot place for 18 years. So we're all dysfunctional. We all screwed up. All our parents screwed us up, and so be it. And you try to function in life as best as you can, despite the fact that you got 2 parents that screwed you up however they did. But the idea that CPS or judges or any other bureaucrat is going to make a decision better than the parents, I think is foolhardy. So, it's not legal to beat your kids. It's certainly not legal to molest your kids. It's not legal to drink and be around your kids. It's certainly not legal to do drugs and be around your kids. So if you're doing those things and some other things that are illegal, Law and Order SVU should investigate you. And if there's enough evidence, convict you, and then they take your kids. If, you think that your kid's fever went down and the doctor disagreed with you,
Yeah.
stay out of that. The other stuff you need to stay out of. Their parents will make bad mistakes, and in certain cases, those bad mistakes will lead to tragic outcomes.
Right.
But I am more. Look, we got 300 million people in this world. The real foolhardy thing is the person who thinks they can come up with a solution that fixes everything for everyone. That's the real foolhardy thing. Is here's my solution, and we're going to protect every child. You can't protect every child.
Right.
You have 300 million people in this country. Some kids are going to be vulnerable no matter what. I would err on the side of the parents screwing them up as opposed to the state or some other bureaucrat screwing them up. And so if a parent's committed a crime, let the police investigate. If they haven't committed a crime, stay out of their way. And you live with the consequences. And if in certain cases that means a parent that maybe in another scenario would have been removed isn't removed, that's what happens. But I think on the whole, you have a much better functioning society. So my solution is simple: get rid of CPS. And you know what? You got some people listening. Just do a thought experiment and call and say, I heard this idea. What do you think? It's a state legislator, so don't call your congressman because they don't oversee CPS. Call it whatever state you're in. I heard this. What do you think of this idea? Is it too radical to get rid of CPS? Because
maybe it would save money too. We always hear about cost-cutting measures. It would be great if we could save money by making something more efficient and more effective rather than having all this bloated bureaucracy. Skyhawk56 is in the YouTube comments telling us that if you're dirt poor, CPS will just give you a warning. But if you have money, then they'll take your kids and charge you every day that they have them.
Maybe. No, they sometimes they'll take the kid, claim, they won't ever say it's because you're poor. They'll take the kid because you're poor, because the wealthy parents will have more resources to fight it. And they'll get the shark lawyer who will step in with his entire law firm, whereas the poor family will not. They don't have those kinds of resources.
So, Michael, it's been just a couple weeks since your article came out here in the Daily Caller. Has it generated a lot of communications? Have people contacted you? Are there any new leads? Anything happened since the beginning of May with this case?
With the case? Well, what happened since the article came out? What happened is that they've been placed back with their parents. But I should note they've been placed back with their parents, but the court is still involved in some sort of oversight role. It's not clear what that oversight role is, but let's just say the parents don't have complete control to make every decision. The court is signing off on certain decisions.
It's humiliating and I mean, that would be infuriating if you were a parent.
Parenting by bureaucrat. Parenting by bureaucrat.
Some judge who doesn't.
That's infuriating. I should send you some custody order decisions, and you should see what judges say. You're allowed to see your kids this day. You're allowed to do this. You're not allowed to do that. You're allowed to take them here. You're not allowed to take them here. And if you take them here, you have to take them here at this time. If you're infuriated by that, I'll send you some custody orders. You'll get really infuriated by all of the directions that judges, who often don't even see the children, give to parents as they parent them.
Pretty bad.
Right.
Shocking information, Michael. I really have to say, you're doing great work, very bold. This is the type of thing we need to do. We need to get in there and raise awareness, because I think a lot of people just don't know that this is going on. It seems like a pretty obviously huge problem. So it's amazing to me.
Can I give you my theory for why?
Sorry? Yeah.
Can I give you my theory for why?
Yes.
I believe that we have a left-right media. So liberals have their perspective, conservatives have their perspective. So why immigration is covered a lot, do you agree?
Yeah. We never hear about this.
Right. So liberals cover it from their bent, conservatives cover it from their bent. Healthcare, taxes. There is no liberal view on Department of Welfare, on foster care, on judges. There's a liberal and conservative view on appeals court judges, but certainly not judges who decide family court matters. So the reason I think is very, very cynical, because the average journalist, you bring this to them, and if they're a conservative, they're thinking, well, how does this advance my cause? They're not going to say this to you. They're going to think, well, how does this advance my cause? Well, it doesn't. If they're a liberal, they're going to think, well, how does this advance my cause? Well, it doesn't. And so they skip it. That's my theory.
Wow. And, as you're talking, it's reminding me that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is extremely concerned with how the alleged children of people who are trying to illegally cross the border into the United States, many cases, we're hearing story after story where DNA tests show these children aren't even with their actual parents, but they're more concerned about the separation of those families, which we have no idea what the condition of that is. I mean, if a child is with, we don't know how many there are, but if a child is with an adult who's committing a crime, you're not going to put a child into an adult prison, nor would you put an adult into a containment facility with other children. So they inherently have to be separated. But I don't hear anybody talking about this. Normal children living in Arizona.
Even though these are American kids,
right?
And you're talking about a couple of thousand migrant kids, we're talking about nearly 500,000 kids in foster care. If it's anywhere near 90% who shouldn't be there, you're talking about hundreds of thousands of kids in foster care. Nobody talks about them. You're absolutely right. And again, why? I don't think it's on her radar, because it doesn't advance her cause.
Right.
Why would I need to stand up for a kid in foster care? How does that help my liberal philosophy? How does it help the conservative philosophy? I think it's a libertarian thing, but even libertarians, I don't know that, does Rand Paul talk about this? And Kentucky, you think Arizona's bad? Kentucky's right there with Arizona in terms of kids being taken. So I don't know how often Rand Paul has talked about this. Is it on his radar?
I'm here on childrensrights.org. I haven't heard of this before, but this is talking about foster care. Many of America's child welfare systems are badly broken. On any given day, there are nearly 443,000 children in foster care in the United States. In 2017, more than 690,000 children spent time in U.S. foster care. This is an entire city worth of children who are taken from their parents. So you're saying 90% of them.
Maybe it's not 90% in Arizona,
even if it's 30%.
But look, in my estimation, in 90% of the cases, even if the parent, the blood parent, has no business being a parent, they're still better off with the parent than in foster care. And certainly the serial killer's children believed it, because they were so desperate to stay in their father's care that they played nice with the CPS caseworker. They could have at any time said, our dad molested us, get us out of here, quick, we'll go with you
I presume
right now.
those children are adults now. The father's been put to death. Right. What's going on with them? Do we know?
Well, I saw her on Evil Lives Here. She told her story. She told her story. I saw a wedding ring, something that looked like a wedding ring, so presumably she got married. I think from what I remember, one of the kids kind of disappeared, and the one who told her story, I don't know how. Look, you cannot even imagine.
Yeah, I think if your father's a serial killer, you got a whole lot of stuff going on.
Right. So you can only imagine. She's as functional, I think, as you can possibly hope if you're the daughter of a serial killer. But
Right.
she said her sister and her at some point drifted apart. So who knows what happened to the other sister? But they were enough convinced that the serial killer was better that they played it off like everything was great in their house.
Wow. Michael, this is amazing work. People can see Michael Volpe's article in the Daily Caller. Just go to thedailycaller.com, and this article is telling us about how Arizona's Department of Child Safety has a pattern of sending SWAT teams for medical kidnapping. It's an open question to what extent this is related to people who are opposed to vaccinating their children with unknown chemicals. And
hey, CPS will swear up and down they don't take kids who are not vaccinated. So obviously, since we can take their word for it, it has absolutely no relation. We can take their word for it. Look, I'm being sarcastic. I don't think that the way CPS would do it is they wouldn't take your kid because you're unvaccinated. They just find a stupid reason and take the kid because he's unvaccinated.
And then I wonder, are they vaccinating the kids there at CPS? I bet they would.
And I do believe that Big Pharma is making big bucks. And I think the really tricky part is it's very hard to track that. They're making money. I absolutely believe they're making money. But
do we know if the Chandler, Arizona family's kids have been vaccinated while in foster care or child protective services?
I do not know. There's limited information. There's an excellent article in the Arizona Republic the last 2 days, which describes how little information has gotten out and how much judges, multiple, have gone out of their way to limit the information in this case.
Wow.
I think what happened is, and here's what happened. This happens a lot, and they screwed up, and the media found out, and now they're doing everything they can.
Backpedaling, covering it up.
Backpedal. They can't completely shut it down because that's going to be too obvious. So they're like, well, you can release information just a little bit, and it's not really helping. The Arizona Republic is doing good work. I've done some stuff. Other people have done some stuff. I think they've opened up a can of worms. I think none of these people thought that this would create the kind of firestorm that it's created, which means if you care, you should be reading these articles, you should be sharing them, and you should be telling other people to read them, because obviously they have something to hide.
Absolutely. I got to tell you, Michael, I'm a little surprised. We only have 276 viewers right now, which is frankly a pretty low number. I wonder if perhaps the hashtags or the title that I've selected for the video may have caused some suppression. There's been a lot of that going on with YouTube lately. But people can follow Michael's work. You can go to the Provocateur, and remember there's 2 E's in the right here, theprovocateur.blogspot.com. He's got a book called Bullied to Death, and you can purchase his book on the website. Michael Volpe, I want to thank you very much for some really great work and certainly opening my eyes to what seems like a massive problem that I really hope more people will become aware of.
We got time for one more anecdote?
Yes.
All right. There was a woman named Georgia Tan, and she originally created the adoption industry, and all of these things flow together. And she was a baby thief, and she took kids mostly from poor families. And Nature Boy Ric Flair, who you probably heard of, the wrestler, he was actually one of the kids taken. She created and was the first person to promote closed adoptions, which means it's all sealed. And she did that because it was easier to steal the kids.
Wow.
There are still states today that have closed adoptions, even though the reason she created closed adoptions was to make it easier to steal the kids.
This woman was alive until 1950.
Still on the books today for closed adoptions, as if they're a good idea, even though the person who created them only created them so they could hide the stealing of kids. Wow. So kids are stolen in foster care. They're stolen through the adoption system. And some of the kids wound up in good homes. There she is. Nature Boy Ric Flair was one of them. Other kids wound up in horrible homes. But she took them from almost exclusively from poor families. But that's something else. There's something you should call. Call and ask your state legislator if they have open or closed adoptions in their state. And if they say they're closed, you should ask, well, do you understand that the reason the closed adoptions were created was that a woman named Georgia Tan wanted to hide the stealing of kids?
This woman looks like somebody's grandmother. She looks like a nice lady, and she's a kidnapper.
Right. Yeah. Well, we'll put up a photo of Ted Bundy.
Right.
You know, I watch Joe Kenda. Now I'm not going to remember the title of his show, but he was a homicide detective, and one of the things he said is, you know what a killer looks like? Killer looks like everyone. Everyone is capable. So this idea that someone doesn't look like they could do harm is foolhardy.
Yeah,
look,
I mean, this guy looks like he would be on the next, WB show about going to college or something.
Absolutely, and he played off of that, and so did she. Georgia Tan looked like she couldn't hurt a fly, and she knew it, and she knew it. And that's why she hurt. That's one of the reasons why she hurt a lot of people.
Wow.
But your viewers, if you're listening, you should call and ask if your state has closed adoptions, and you can educate your state legislator about how closed adoptions first got started.
Amazing.
And see if they want to sponsor a bill to make them open. There's no reason to have closed adoptions.
Yeah.
They're only in place because a woman who wanted to steal kids wanted to make it easier. That's the only reason.
Really unbelievable, Michael. Well, all right, so people are suggesting that you watch Kids, Inc., the documentary. Yeah, I mean, this is an important show for us to have done. So I want to thank Joe Napoli for introducing us, and I want to thank you for taking the time to come on the show. Michael, you've got an open invitation. Anytime something important comes up, let's have you back on, and thank you for this important work that you're doing.
Okay, very good. Have a good evening.
Have a great evening, and thanks for watching, everybody. I'll see you tomorrow. Don't forget to tune in for Discovery CSI with David Hawkins. And make sure you go to patreon.com/crowdsourcethetruth and subscribestar.com/crowdsourcethetruth. Thanks very much to Michael. I'll see everybody tomorrow.